Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Harm Reduction Report. From the Sandbagger Newsroom in Colorado, this is Willard T-Belly reporting in to KEQQ Radio in Grand Forks. Wishing you a happy, hopefully somewhat warm sort of day out there. I hear it's been pretty wild. It's not been so bad for us. The snow is melted. We had a snow day the same day y'all had a snow day, actually. And they were calling it here Snowmageddon, and probably I think I heard my mother call the storm up north the same thing. Anywho, hope we all made it through that okay. It is March 16th for me now as I send out this new episode. I'm really excited. I'm really excited for this one, and I'm excited to be with you again, be at the helm. Honestly, I haven't made an episode since the last one, which has been playing on the radio for the last couple weeks in a row, about my friend Larry who died. I was actually just on my way to Larry's funeral right after I submitted the last episode, but that was a fun one. Rereading all of those articles that Larry wrote for the student newspaper when we worked there together back at our glory days at the University of North Dakota, college days. That was a fun one, but at the end of this episode, I'm going to play a song for Larry. Larry taught me all about Pink Floyd, and he taught me about the song Wish You Were Here, which of course is a song everyone thinks of when they are lonely and missing someone who's not here for one reason or another. I've thought of many of my friends who I've lost who've died from drugs, or just people I've lost for, maybe they didn't even die, I just lost them somehow, right? These people, I've thought of many of these people, and I've thought of this song while thinking of them. And Larry showed me this song, but I never once considered that I would have to be thinking of Larry when I thought of this song in this way, though he did show me. He showed me it for the first time. So, anywho, finally learned how to play it, and I'm going to play it at the end of the episode. But we've got a few fun things to get through before we get to that. So, as we've discussed before, we're liking to make another emphasis on the show, sort of a shift in focus from what we've been talking about for our first 44 episodes. Has been heavy on talking about substance use and substance abuse and stigma related to substance use, alcohol and drugs and stuff like that. And that's totally great, and we should keep doing that. We will always keep talking about that on the show, because that's what we first started. That's why we're here. That's why we started a thing, a radio show. So, but there's more we want to talk about, including how do principles of harm reduction relate to other aspects of stigma or other areas of potential harm that exist in our society. And one area I'm quite interested in is the interaction between humans and the environment. So what is it like to have a harm reduction based mindset when considering society's impact on the environment? And this doesn't have to get political in a certain way you all might jump to. And, I jump to a certain sort of, is this going to be like this versus that sort of blah, blah, blah kind of thing with certain views being proposed? Well, I guess I hope not. I really want to be sincere thinking about how does harm reduction relate to environmental choices. So when we're talking about this case that we'll be talking a lot about, because I happen to be studying it in grad school now, is the story about the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness of the Superior National Forest in northeast Minnesota. Beautiful, wonderful place, internationally recognized wonderful place. We'll see how do principles of harm reduction potentially relate to environmental issues, and how can we be mindful of that, just as we're mindful of some of these things related to substance abuse, or at least as we're trying to be. So in order to get us into this conversation, I would like to spend the next 20 minutes or so reading this essay I just wrote, and I'll explain it to you. I wrote it for this publication called Voices of the Valley, which is something I've written for before, and I've actually read my essays on the show before. I've written for them. I think this is the 4th year in a row. And yeah, some of my other essays were sort of about harm reduction related things. So I think I read them all in various episodes throughout the last 45 episodes we put out. You can check out the Harm Reduction Report episode log and figure out which episodes those were if you want to look back and find those ones. Anywho, the episode, the essay I wrote this year is all about the history of the Boundary Waters, its controversial beginnings more than 100 years ago when the area was first established, all the various transitions that the wilderness and the regulations and the visitorship and everything that's happened there, the businesses related to it, the extraction, like logging and mining that has and has not happened, and the impacts it has had on communities. And the very founding of many of these communities were from logging and mining companies looking to start a business. And yeah, it's very interesting. I learned all about this mainly from 2 books, and actually pretty much all the factual claims that I make in this essay, I pulled directly from these 2 books. And I'd love to explain them and recommend you read them if you're interested, because they read really well. It was fun to read these books for fun, basically. And then I decided to write my essay about it, so it all turned out pretty well. But yeah, the one book is called Saving Quetico Superior by R. Newell Searle. And it basically describes the whole legal story. It focuses in the beginning on, well, I guess in my essay, I sort of break it up into 3 or 4 different phases of controversy that the Boundary Waters have ultimately been through since the last 150 years or so. But Saving Quetico Superior goes through most of that, and it's a very interesting, compelling story with, like, I think this whole thing should be made into a feature-length movie, like a drama, because it's so epic. There's some epic scenes. And although I don't think there's any gunfire involved, there is some drama, as you'll see, some violence. And so stay tuned. But that was a great book. And the other book that I based this thing on is called Keeper of the Wild by Joe Paddock. And this is a biography of Ernest Oberholzer. And he mainly is involved in the first half or so of the whole Saving Quetico Superior saga, maybe the first 2/3. But the Joe Paddock book, Keeper of the Wild, focuses entirely on Ober, and it's really fascinating. And Ober's Island, Mallard Island, which is mentioned in this upcoming essay here, is a place I'll be living at for a week at the end of the summer. And I'll get to look through Ober's library and learn more about him and learn more about the whole history of this controversy and whatnot. So I'm really excited, and that's part of the reason why I wrote this essay about Ober, because I'm going to Ober's house on Mallard Island at the end of the summer. So I'd sort of like to educate myself. So that's sort of why I wrote my essay on this topic, and it's why I'd like to link it into what we're doing with the Harm Reduction Report these days, talking about environmental harm reduction, because it's an interesting story. And I happen to be focusing my whole grad school project on like building on studying this stuff, I guess. Something that I'm working on now will ultimately, I think, build up to this deliberative event I would like to organize, possibly a series of deliberative events, possibly out on Mallard Island, where 100 years ago, people were talking about this stuff and making management decisions and trying to be mindful of the environment while supporting communities and everything. So it's a really great topic. And let's put our harm reduction stigma, substance use skills that we've gained over the last 45 weeks together, and let's see how we can apply them to environmental concepts. Go in with it really sincere, put all of our political things aside and our assumptions aside, and I don't know. Let's just, I guess, see. And this essay is by no means like any fact of claim that we should begin this conversation on, I guess. But it is my attempt to begin the conversation. So I guess here we go. It's called The Hill of Three Waters. The first part's a little trippy, told from the perspective of the Red River itself. "O Hill of Three Waters, I can feel you from here. On the edge of existence, in misty perfection pitched, twisting tales of the great continental drainage ditches. What starts as water hauling from the heavens with it innocence ends in this living silver wilderness of blue-green rivers, criss across unending beds of moss, insisting only on its isness. But no raindrop you meet will ever want to believe that the fate that's found to be fit for it might be so flippantly picked by a transient destiny whistling its spit on some hooligan wind or the vagabond breeze. For thee, my old cousin of rock and topog, though lay you there low among the lost Masabi peaks, are now the tallest bone of the mountain corpse below, jutting up crumbled from dark stone buried and forgotten by time long ago. Because of you, the waters flow the way they best know. A raindrop falling on your northern face would join the feeding streams trickling into Red Lake, then slowly press their way westward to me, the muddy Red River of the flat country, to roll the roar north toward the old Hudson Bay, forever for the open, cold, ferocious Arctic Ocean's endless day. A raindrop falling on your western face would not take long to make its way to the banks of the great Mississippi River, which would swiftly deliver with ravenous steam any stream from the north to the sea of the south out the mouth of the glorious Gulf of Mexico. A raindrop falling on your eastern face would trickle directly to Lake Superior, slosh between the Great Lakes of the St. Lawrence Seaway, weaving east as it goes to its inevitable new home in the wild and far-off Atlantic Ocean. O Hill of Three Waters, how does it know from which path to come or which way to go? The people of my valley are in deep need of learning from one such as you, who has seen it all, from the rise and fall from the dead Masabi halls to glaciation and the colonial malls. Well, everybody knows lakes think in prose, but rivers live much more melodically in poems. So grab your paddles and listen close to the story of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, yo. Bacchus and the Roadless Buyouts. I'll miss E.O. One cannot be in harness with a teammate so long without missing him. Ernest C. Oberholzer. Among the merchants of mercilessness who came to the Northlands after the fur trade was one most ruthless fruit of the pioneering vine who would dedicate his career to turn the Boundary Waters into a water storage basin. Edward Wellington Bacchus, suburban Minnesota boy and U of M dropout turned infamous millionaire lumberman in the years preceding the Great Depression. In one of Bacchus's favorite memories, he strapped on snowshoes and trudged 200 miles through the lake country to survey a place he hoped to purchase, the Couchiching Falls on the Rainy River on the Canadian border. The beauty of the scene, as Bacchus always described it, is gripping and undeniable, but it is unknown whether he enjoyed this view as much as would have the legions of unborn generations who would, because of him, never get the chance to see it. Bacchus owned an island on Rainy Lake near International Falls, where he would nurse his professional relationships by entertaining distinguished guests in a lavish resort-style atmosphere designed to earn him political favor. But less than a 15-minute canoe ride away, on another island on the same lake, lived someone who would haunt Bacchus till the very end of his life. The small, humble Harvard graduate from Iowa named Ernest Oberholzer. Ober, for short. In 1925, Bacchus submitted a proposal to the International Joint Commission, the IJC, which oversaw the complex management of the Quetico Superior Boundary Waters ecosystem, to build a series of dams that would harness the river and waterfalls for hydropower. The dams, however, would also raise the water levels of vast swaths of the watershed, causing devastating and widespread destruction of private property and public wilderness for the benefit of Backus's business alone. Ober, assisted by a group of environmental lawyers meeting secretively in Minneapolis basements, raised $500 to purchase a transcript of the IJC meeting so they could build an argument against Backus's plan. During the 9-year period while U.S. and Minnesota legislators deliberated the merits of Ober's alternative, the forcible and fortunate Backus engaged in activities that at the very least must be considered of extremely bad taste. These political strategies included threatening newspaper editors to whom he sold paper, and buying a popular outdoors magazine to offer free advertising to private interests in exchange for political capital. One of the most dishonest moves of the Backus campaign was to organize a grassroots group of local hunters and conservative environmentalists, then submit a formal complaint against Ober's plan on the group's behalf without informing the membership. When Ober secured himself an opportunity to address the group in person, the members found out what the Backus organizers had done. That night, before formally ejecting the Backus supporters who had founded the group, the Grassroots Club voted unanimously to support Ober's alternative. During his first summer in the Quetico Superior, Ober canoed more than 3,000 miles. More than a decade later, at the height of this controversy, he still averaged 500 canoe miles a year on reconnaissance missions with his friends, scouting out locations that would be affected by Backus's plans and interviewing local people about the impacts they would experience. In 1927, Ober correctly predicted a devastating flood caused by what he called the unpardonable arrogance of Backus's irresponsible manipulation of water levels in the Rainy Lake watershed. Instead of allowing such waste and destruction, Ober believed, the public ought to set aside the entire area as an international park between Canada and the U.S. dedicated to peace and wilderness preservation. The Backus threat was finally eliminated by the U.S. Shipstead-Nolan Act of 1930, and a similar act passed in the Minnesota legislature 3 years later that applied to state lands. Both outlawed the destructive and wasteful consequences of Backus's dam plan and delineated regulatory zones providing for scientifically informed multiple uses of the land for the entire public's benefit. In the heat of the Depression, Ober agonized over the $4,000 debt held by the Quetico Superior Council. Backus, on the other hand, had driven his businesses into more than $40 million in debt. After persistently losing a series of lawsuits against him, Backus was even kicked out of his own company, who he then led a very public campaign against, blaming his predicament on a vast conspiracy of Eastern bankers seeking to corrupt the Minnesotan economy. True to character, Backus never gave up. At the age of 73, he flew to New York on a doomed business trip where he died alone in his hotel room of a heart attack, abandoned by the floundering empire he had built. County governments in northeast Minnesota also suffered during and after the Great Depression. Lake, St. Louis, and Cook counties, for example, were considering selling land to the U.S. Forest Service, which wanted to expand the Superior National Forest. But to the counties, losing land meant losing future opportunities to develop taxable property on it. Additionally, years of mistrust between the federal agency and local communities had created friction which threatened to bloom into a full-blown controversy as big as the Backus problem. Resistance grew as the possibility that the government might condemn private property and force buyouts in the wilderness area seemed more likely. Meanwhile, the automobile began to transform the concept of outdoor recreation by suddenly empowering millions of Americans with the ability to visit national parks and forests. Hardline preservationists didn't want any roads or development to penetrate the silence and solitude of the canoe area.
The U.S. Forest Service wanted some roads to better provide emergency fire control services, and private extraction and power companies wanted their own roads with which to carry out the land's valuable natural resources. To represent them in the 1947 deliberations of the county land deals, the Quetico Superior Council hired Sigurd F. Olson, writer, outfitter, and retiring dean of the Ely Junior College. Sig traveled extensively through the U.S. and Canada, canoeing and philosophizing with important political stakeholders to garner their support for the council's mission of reimbursing the counties fairly for the land sale that would allow them to consolidate the roadless area in the national forest. After long, stressful arguments about the price of the land and the government's mode of payment, the committee devised an acceptable reimbursement program. This decision, the Thai-Blatnick Act of 1948, set a bold new precedent for the Forest Service. Buying out private resorts for the sake of environmental conservation and recreation was not only feasible, but now one of the agency's mandated priorities. Aerial invasion. Before a solution was found, the question of aircraft would involve every major level of government, the courts, individuals and organizations through the nation, and the President of the United States. In Ely, it would set neighbor against neighbor and friend against friend in the bitterest battle the Quetico Superior Country had yet seen. R. Newell Searle. Prohibiting roads in the canoe area succeeded to deter further development and reduce visitation pressure on the wilderness. But at the end of World War II, residents of the Northland began hearing more and more commercial airplanes flying over the boundary waters. Soon, the immensity of their impact was apparent. Resort owners hired float plane pilots to fly clients out to remote lakes, where easy visitation put heavy pressure on even the most remote corners of the wilderness. One of the members of the underground group in Minneapolis that helped Ober deflect the Bacchus threat was a lawyer named Frank B. Hubachek. He believed banning aircraft in the roadless areas would reduce the impact on the environment and thereby better ensure the sustainability of the current canoe-based tourist economy. Or, Hub wrote, the local tourism industry might, quote, open the wilderness areas, skim off the cream in a few years, eliminate the wilderness permanently, and then relapse into a minor and mediocre tourist trade, end quote. Both Ober and Sig mobilized on the aircraft issue, traveling to garner support and formally requesting the President of the United States to declare an executive no-fly zone over the roadless areas of the Superior National Forest. While conservationists awaited a response, resort owners continued to build up their businesses in the wilderness areas. At the time of the aircraft deliberations, Ely struggled economically. Since its founding by members of the extraction industry in 1884, Ely has suffered from a dominating influence of competing corporate and federal interests. The mining, logging, and power companies that provided the community with jobs also supplied a great deal of public services to support the workforce, but they were still owned by corporate outsiders who would never live there themselves. Likewise, the U.S. Forest Service may have been mandated to operate in the public's interests, but many of its decisions affecting the local communities near Ely were still made by bureaucratic outsiders in Washington, D.C. Therefore, the frustration of the Ely Chamber of Commerce, which championed mining and tourism industries most of all, was not unexpected. One of the group's leaders, local restaurant owner John Schmecker, worked hard to keep the airspace open for fly-in resort tourism. Schmecker's challenges eventually put the case before the U.S. Justice Department to decide if the president had the authority to enact airspace restrictions for the sake of wilderness preservation after all. Schmecker's political strategies during this time were strongly reminiscent of Bacchus's underhanded attempts to sway public opinion with dishonest communication. Schmecker, with his current allies in Ely, formed what they called a grassroots organization of community support and used it to distribute lies about the council's long-term management intentions for the Boundary Waters. Other evidence reportedly suggests Schmecker even forged a judge's signature on an important legal document regarding the new restrictions. Responding to the personal and political smears Schmecker had spread, Hubcheck wrote a full-page ad in the Ely Minor newspaper, refuting with evidence all the claims made against him and the council. When confronted and challenged to provide evidence to the contrary, Schmecker disappeared. In the end, he failed to show up to a scheduled debate at a radio station he had agreed to participate in with Sigurd Olsen. Sig didn't even have to drop the mic for everyone to know who won. Soon thereafter, in 1949, President Truman authorized the executive airspace restriction over the Superior National Forest roadless areas. Residents were given a 2-year grace period before the air ban would take effect, and its opponents used this time to express their protest. Some resort pilots brazenly boasted their disregard for the new rule by claiming they would fly in 1952 despite the ban. Just 2 days after the new rule's implementation, a pilot working for their resort owner named Zupp called himself into authorities just before he took off so the federal district agent could witness the rule's first official violation. As Zupp expected, federal agents confronted him, and he eventually brought a case to Washington challenging the legality of the executive air ban. When the federal judge ruled against him, Zupp demanded an exorbitant settlement amount for the Forest Service should they wish to buy his property and close his operations in the protected areas. While they waited for a result of the appeal, Zupp and friends made hundreds of illegal flights to their resort, even advertising them via the U.S. Postal Service. Their disrespect for the executive order attracted the attention of the FBI, which eventually investigated, seizing a plane and finding one pilot in the process. Having lost the ability to fly to his resort in the roadless area, Zupp invested in a failed attempt to build a wider waterway between there and the nearest road. A plan which included dynamiting portages and fundamentally altering the nature of the river system to allow the passage of motorboats in places where only canoes could go before. When that became too expensive, Zupp decided he wanted a road in the roadless area. Before selling out to the Forest Service, Zupp petitioned to use an existing old railway path as a private road to better access his property. He also filed suit against a lumber company for use of one of their old private roads, but both times the courts, unsurprisingly, denied his request to use a road in the roadless area. As his options collapsed, Zupp resorted to the most militaristic depiction of the controversy thus far. Behind the wheel of a Weasel, a semi-amphibious military vehicle used to support troops up the D-Day invasion beaches of World War II, Zupp illegally drove straight up the waterways, transporting goods and guests to his resort, while, in the words of Arnold Searle, consequently churning the portages into muddy ruts. Finally, Zupp brought a bulldozer up to the U.S. Forest Service fence, broke the locks on the gate, and drove through to blaze himself a path through the roadless area. Another time, Zupp approached the gate with a van full of guests, when he discovered the agent on duty had repaired the locks on the fence and parked his truck across the entrance. In full view of his guests, Zupp threatened to kill the federal agent at the gate with a crowbar. Sidestepping authority, Zupp broke the locks again and drove his guests around the agent's barricade through the roadless area to their resort. Zupp's case against the air ban was not aided by these violent actions. Though his partners soon sold their properties to the U.S. Forest Service, Zupp held on to his until the 1960s, when, as authorized by the Thai-Blatnik Act, the U.S. Forest Service finally condemned and closed Zupp's resort for good. This set a precedent which would guide the federal agency's management of the other 72 national forests under its jurisdiction. Now the Forest Service mandates to consolidate the roadless areas in the Boundary Waters have been supported by the courts, and this would encourage the agency to consider using such tactics elsewhere. Treaty for the International Park. We should not let an early choice of phrase kill a worthwhile proposal because of the failure to admit the possibility of change. Sigurd F. Olson. Once the U.S. had succeeded to repel the Bacchus threat, establish roadless areas in the Superior National Forest, authorize the U.S. Forest Service to buy out private businesses in the wilderness area, and prohibit private aircraft over the protected lakes, the controversy remained far from resolved. For Ober, the current protection of the Quetico Superior Wilderness Area was merely the prototype of his grandest vision, an expansion of the restricted multiple-use area to include the entire 11 million-acre watershed system constituting the internationally managed peace park of his dreams. Thus far, the managers of Ontario's Quetico Provincial Park seemed interested in preserving their natural resources. When the U.S. had started buying up private property in the Boundary Waters, the Canadian governments suspended land purchasing around the Quetico too, matching management practices in the meantime until a stronger international agreement seemed more feasible. But by the early 1950s, Ontario grew more resistant to attempts to turn the Quetico Provincial Park into a federally co-managed international space. Reasonably, they felt entitled not to give up their responsibility of the wilderness area, and any attempts of federal authorities to wrest ownership of the land from them seemed arrogant and unfair. Once again, Ober and Sigg went to work, writing the draft of a treaty they would give to the Canadian federal government to propose to Ontario. But this time, Ober and Sigg held disagreements over the fundamental vision of the Quetico Superior Council. Whereas Ober still had hopes to protect the 11 million-acre wilderness, Sigg believed it necessary to compromise and focus on keeping the 2 million acres of the currently protected Quetico Superior. After arguing over 6 different drafts, Ober and Sigg came up with something the Canadian federal government was happy with, but they still needed to convince the Ontario government to cede control of their park to the federal coalition, which seemed increasingly unlikely. Based on the geography and relative lack of roads in the Canadian territory, the people of Ontario had virtually no access to the Quetico Park, without first driving into the U.S. and entering across the border by water from the south. Meanwhile, wealthy resort owners in the U.S. went to the Quetico all the time, and reports of some of their unsustainable practices made Ontario residents naturally resentful of their American counterparts, who would seem to benefit disproportionately by the creation of an international park. Finally, Ontario refused the treaty, and future hopes of protecting the entire 11 million acres of Ober's dreams were dashed. Ontario did, however, sign onto an official agreement between the province and the U.S. Forest Service regarding future management of the combined wilderness area. This agreement imposed no binding regulations on either government, other than the promise to let each other know if they plan on making any changes to their management strategies that could influence the shared ecosystem. To ensure this promise was upheld, the governments established the Quetico Superior International Advisory Committee, which convened its first meeting at Hubachek's house on Basswood Lake in the early 1960s. By then, the conservation movement had come a long way, but another fear of Ober's was just beginning to be realized. The Boundary Waters had become overrun with visitors, despite the air ban and roadless areas. Reportedly trashed with beer cans, picnic supplies, and discarded gear, the campsites in the Boundary Waters were barely livable. In 1964, the historic 4-mile portage was lined with dozens of abandoned automobiles, broken boats, and wasted camping equipment. The Forest Service knew it had to find another way to limit visitation to the wilderness or risk losing it altogether. Its solution? Prohibiting motors in the roadless areas, which would mean sacrificing the visitorship of motorboatists for that of canoeists and hikers only. Talk of this decision elicited explosive reactions from some local resorts and outfitters with invested interests in using motorboats in the Boundary Waters, while other outfitters invested more in canoe tourism were better prepared for the motor ban. No matter where people stood, the controversy was bitter and painful for all involved. The Wilderness Act of 1964 and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness Act of 1978 officially outlawed motors in most of the roadless areas, while other visitation limitations further reduced pressure on the wilderness. Though Ober would never achieve his dream of creating an international park, the significance of which the world had never before seen, what he did was much more subtle than that, but perhaps none the less important. As Ober got older, he tragically began to lose control of his mental and physical capabilities. Near the end, he could neither walk nor speak, but he still managed to communicate with hand gestures. But one day, while being pushed in a wheelchair down the street in International Falls, someone approached Ober and said, "Boozoo." Amazingly, despite his condition, the two carried on a complete conversation in the Ojibwe language, though Ober would never speak English again before his death at the age of 93. When Sig gave the eulogy at Ober's funeral, he described his old friend and ally as the ultimately inspiring canoe man. Adventure certainly was a pillar of Ober's life, but his biographer thought Sig was more so the canoe man. Deep down, Ober was a teacher. 10 years later, at the age of 82, Sig strapped on snowshoes and left his house for the last hike of his life. Found in the typewriter on his desk the day he died was his final message, quote, "A new adventure is coming up, and I'm sure it will be a good one." Drawing from its century-long history of controversy, the adventure to manage the Quetico Superior Wilderness is one that promises to last for a long time to come, requiring the rise of a new generation of conservationists with the vision of Ober, the persuasiveness of Sig, the persistence of the Sandbag and Red River, and the wild unity of the one and only Boundary Waters. Red River Dream. You cannot destroy one who has dreamed a dream like mine. Anishinaabe proverb. O hill of three waters, do you dream what I dream? Are the plights of tomorrow as grim as they seem? Trials behind and pitfalls below. My superior's fine, but how fares your dear friend the old red of the north? 100 years passed between the second largest flood in the history of the Red River Valley and the first in 1997. Each event was a grand reminder of what little control people hold over nature. Each inspired immediate activism and community-wide camaraderie, the likes of which the people had never before remembered feeling. Similarly, 100 years have passed since the first deliberative gathering of stakeholders in the Boundary Waters attempted to reconcile their differences and compromise on some difficult management decisions. But by most accounts, that first public meeting merely made people's opinions more divisive. Meeting but failing to inspire mutual respect with one another, the actors only managed to become more combative, adding to the struggle of the last century. Not a single person who attended the first deliberative gathering in the Boundary Waters is alive today. Yet many of the very same stakeholder groups are active in the controversy still. Nor does a single drop of water remain from the original Rainy Lake watershed that Ober first dreamed of protecting when he came to Minnesota. But the Boundary Waters themselves certainly do. O hill of three waters, could it be I'm mistaken? They say you're fenced off by a mining operation. Well, never you fear, a fence might stop a deer, but rain will seep as deep as it dares, and rapids be running with never a care. While the wilderness lives, we have nothing to fear.
Yeah, nice. Well, thank you for listening to that. I realized it got a little dramatic right at the end, and it a little limerickish. But yeah, thank you for listening. Honestly, I had fun writing it. I like writing stuff like this, and I don't get to do. I don't do it that often. I don't make time for it necessarily. I mean, I do a lot of writing in school these days, but it's sort of different. But this is like a yearly thing. I always make sure I do, because they give me the opportunity to write for them, and I'm very grateful for it. So shout out to Aaron and Emily, who run Voices of the Valley, the publication through the Unity Writers Conference that supports me and lots of other lots of other people around Grand Forks to write about this stuff. So thanks. So, one theme of my life that I have developed as a grad student in school here is to kill two birds with one stone whenever possible. I don't know if there's also other less violent sounding metaphors to use, but I really like this one of killing birds. And so with that in mind, I'd like to talk about my homework, because I need to think about it before I turn it in. And it's actually possibly interesting topic matter for the show here. So I'm going to brainstorm on some homework ideas here, in the sense that I actually want to explain. I'm in 3 different classes right now. And in all my classes, I would make a strong argument to y'all that I'm thinking about harm reduction in a very critical, interesting way. Well, ways that are interesting to me because I never thought of them in these ways before. And I just would like to explain some of the projects I have going on, because some of them relate directly to people we've talked a lot with and about on the show, including our friends at the Grand Forks Public Health Department. So perhaps I'll start there. I'm in 3 different classes this semester: health communication, science communication, and deliberation theory. Those first 2 communication classes are in the journalism department here, grad level classes, and that deliberation class is in the communication studies department, which is a whole different thing, believe it or not, from the journalism and media communications department. It's amazing. I'm still learning a lot about how all this scholarly stuff works, but it's pretty interesting. My health communication class, I'm doing a project where I have to build a website, and this website should be designed to communicate some sort of public health related issue in an interesting and clear, concise, independent, nonpartisan kind of way. And so I have been working with our friend Michael Dulitz at the Grand Forks Public Health Department, and he's just given me some ideas, and he's provided me with some data from the city, including his 2018 report that he and a grad student at UND, I forget their name, I'm sorry, who worked on this report, the 2018 Grand Forks Substance Use Report. He provided me with this and some other data, and I'm using it to make a website about this data and about the report mainly. And I'm going to use that as my class project, but also the city of Grand Forks will be able to share this information because it's something they were trying to do anyway. So here we are, again, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, because I'm just simply using my homework assignment, which I have to do anyway for this grad school thing I signed up for, in order to take some work off our friend Michael's plate, help him out in a certain way, and show that, just help him get his information out there, basically. That's all. But it's really fun, and I had a great time building this website. I think soon on an upcoming episode, I'll do a deep dive into the report, into the website, and we'll spend some longer time talking about it. But I just wanted to introduce it for now. This is definitely getting back to our whole thing about substance use. See, I want to have this website actually, we're calling it the G-Funk Harm Reduction Hub. And I've actually had dreams for something called a harm reduction hub for a long time, and I've been writing grant proposals to get funding to work on this thing, and I haven't really found the benefactor yet to support such a thing. But this school assignment, I'm going to start it. I'm going to start the G-Funk Harm Reduction Hub, and it's going to be something that includes resources for all people who are interested in all the information that interested people need, who are looking to navigate the world of, well, especially substance use and stuff, particularly as it relates to G-Funk, and particularly, harm reduction resources for everyone. Archives of all the laws pertaining to all these certain things and procedures, drugs and stuff we're talking about. Archive all the news articles and analyses and clear summaries explaining how different news sources or different actors or stakeholders or companies or government officials or agencies have talked about this stuff in the news and in other places, and just like a full non-controversial website explaining everything you need to know, the sincerest cited information to get the community going, and like links for the community to connect themselves with resources and stuff. There's lots of efforts like this, but I've been having a feeling that there's like definitely things missing, and I can just see one perspective building this website as a way to connect a bunch of already existing resources together and get them to do more stuff they're already trying to do. If there's a way we can help, we might as well go for it. I think there might be. We shall see. Maybe we'll do a part of a whole episode focusing on the HealthCom website and going into Michael's fascinating report and brainstorming about other ways we could best communicate it. For the other class I'm in, the journalism department, science communication, I have been tasked with building this sort of case study. I've got to write just 2,000 words, and on a certain area, a certain product of science communication, I guess. I chose to focus on a few different news articles relating to what that whole essay you just listened to about the Boundary Waters, all those controversies that I described. It's evolved into a new phase of the controversy now, and I think this will be something we talk about a lot about in the upcoming weeks regarding harm reduction, specifically just looking at this test case. And I know it's like a potentially political topic, and I don't really want to have that influence everybody's feelings about this, including my own. So I guess just all we can do is sort of be aware of our feelings as we talk about all this stuff. And, your feelings are not bad or wrong or whatever. So we'll get through it, I think, but wherever we go. The controversy is copper nickel mining near the Boundary Waters. There's two major copper nickel mining operations going on, and I'm going into a deep dive on this for my graduate studies, but for this one assignment I looked at a few news articles and showed how different outlets use different words and framed the controversy differently and interviewed different people as opposed to others. And as for other projects I'm doing later this semester, I'm going to look at the actors themselves and see how their personal and private, corporate, government communications display certain frames and who they interview and how they describe the thing as important, and how the mining company, gets their social license to operate, and how groups oppose them and stuff. I think it's just really fascinating. So I'm looking into that. I believe soon we'll have a episode talking more deeply about the copper nickel mining stuff. Perhaps once my case study's finished, I'll go into it with you, and I'll share that with you in a week or two, going over the article specifically, and we can all brainstorm, develop our own feelings. The other class I'm in, and I believe perhaps next week we'll focus entirely on this topic, the topic of deliberation. So this deliberation class has really changed my idea of a career in this social science world. It's really fun. Deliberation is this scholarly academic thing. It's like people who study it all around the world. It's a relatively new academic field, but it's very supported and excited right now, I think. It involves bringing people into a room and having them express their opinions and like encouraging disagreement, and then ultimately just having everyone deeply understand why everyone holds these disagreements. Often in this process, people change their minds on certain things, or at least understand each other better, which is very helpful to community, as they find. And meanwhile, while they get to the bottom of these community problems, they also, they they learn about the act of deliberation itself, and that's what they're studying. And they learn next time that, okay, putting the X amount of people at a table is better or worse if you have a X amount of a certain kind of prompt or a certain visual aid or something. So it's really interesting and really cool. And it's had some really interesting results. Certain states like Oregon have implemented these deliberation processes like right into their law, actually. So they randomly select people from the community to engage in a deliberative event, and they make a very official sort of thing they hand over to the city or the state in order to make the decisions, how they frame the voting, the things that are going to be voted on and stuff. It's really interesting. So next week, I believe we'll talk deeply about deliberation, and I'll show you a video I just made this week and show you as it relates to the rest of this Boundary Waters thing that I just sort of introduced. The other thing starting this week or next week is, Will Steger is going on this expedition. So I don't know if you know Will Steger. He's this wilderness explorer person. And I'm currently employed to have interesting things. He's going on a 3-month-long expedition up in the north, in the Arctic. And every night he's going to send me a GPS location and an audio message, and I'm going to turn it into a little video and send it out and share it to all his followers. So go ahead and follow along with Will's expedition if you're interested in that. It's really fascinating. We send these videos out to schools in Minnesota who are following along as he's going through his thing, through his spring trip, reporting on the wilderness and things he sees out there. And it's really, really fun, but it also relates to our wilderness harm reduction stuff, simply like survivalist harm reduction. So as that is a harm reduction topic, I think I'll just be sharing some of Will's stories, some of his audio messages right here on the Harm Reduction Report, because he'll send in 5-minute things every day. I could just fill a whole episode with nothing but Will if people really wanted that, but you can hear it on the Steger Wilderness Center Facebook and the StegerWildernessCenter.org if you want to follow along. But I might play some of it and chat about it next week or as the next 3 months go by here on the show, because you might be interested in that. And finally, I'd like to leave this episode like I warned y'all with a song, and it's just wild for me to be saying goodbye to a friend who died, and also Larry would not be someone who would let stigma or anything hold him back from being who he is. And I'm so sad to say, but as it turns out, Larry died from an overdose of substance he was taking. And that makes this song mean even more to us, who loved him so dearly, who he inspired to found the Harm Reduction Report. So you think you can tell heaven from hell, blue skies from pain? Can you tell a green field from a cold steel rail, a smile from a veil? Do you think you can tell? Did they get you to trade your heroes for ghosts, hot ashes for trees, hot air for a cool breeze, cold comfort for change. Did you exchange a walk-on part in the sandbag wall for a lead role in a cage? How I wish you were here. We're just two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl, year after year, running over the same old ground. Well, have we found the same old fears? Well, I wish you were here. I love you, Larry. Miigwech. Sandbag on, everybody.